72 hours. That's how long Naomi Pierce had been breathing in shallow, jagged sips, trying to keep her fractured ribs from puncturing her lungs every time she took a step. 72 hours since Marcus Sterling, a man who wore gold cufflinks but hid the soul of a butcher, had cornered her in the damp shadows of the Nexus parking garage, punishing her for the crime of being too smart and seeing too much. 72 hours of caking thick foundation over a swollen cheekbone, adjusting her rectangular glasses to hide the flicker of pain in her eyes, and drowning the agony in painkillers just to maintain the illusion of the perfect senior auditor. She couldn't afford to fail. She couldn't afford to let the board members see that she was bleeding beneath her white silk blouse. But the human body doesn't care about corporate hierarchies or financial deadlines. On the third day, in the center of the most critical board meeting of the decade, the world turned to gray. Naomi's knees buckled. Her disheveled curls fell forward, and her glasses slipped askew as she began her final descent toward the cold mahogany floor. But the impact never came. Instead of hard wood, she hit a wall of expensive wool and steady muscle. Instead of silence, she heard the sharp intake of breath from a room full of men who were suddenly terrified. Because the massive, tattooed hand that caught her belonged to Joon-seo, the reclusive dragon of the Syndicate. And as he looked down at the rumpled, wounded woman in his arms, the civilized world ended. The war had just begun. The air in the 50th floor boardroom was thin, filtered to a clinical perfection that felt like a chokehold. Naomi stood at the head of the mahogany table, her fingers white-knuckled against the edge of the podium. Every breath was a calculated gamble. Underneath her crisp white blouse, the surgical tape bound her ribs so tightly she could feel the jagged edge of the fracture grinding with every inhale. The third quarter projections for the logistics division show a significant discrepancy, Naomi began, her voice steady despite the cold sweat slicking her palms. Across the table, Marcus Sterling sat with an air of practiced, nonchalant arrogance. He toyed with a heavy gold pen, his eyes boring into her with a silent, predatory threat. "Don't you dare," his gaze said. 3 days ago, those same hands had shattered her composure in the dark of the parking garage. Today, they were ready to applaud her silence. Naomi clicked the remote, the screen behind her flashing with the data that proved Sterling's embezzlement. The room blurred for a second. The high-intensity LED lights overhead became searing white needles. She tried to draw a deep breath to explain the shell companies, but her lungs simply refused to expand. The pain was no longer a dull throb. It was a white-hot blade twisting in her side. As you can see on slide, her voice trailed off into a ragged wheeze. The silence that followed was deafening. The executives leaned forward, some with curiosity, Marcus with a terrifying, expectant smirk. Naomi's rectangular glasses began to slip down the bridge of her nose as her knees turned to water. She reached out to steady herself, but her hand found only empty air. The world tilted, the expensive artwork on the walls spinning into a chaotic swirl of gray and gold. She felt her body give up, the 72 hours of forced strength finally snapping. She was falling, and for a terrifying heartbeat, she braced for the impact of the cold, hard floor, the final humiliation in front of the men who wanted her broken. But the floor never came. Instead, a sudden, overwhelming warmth enveloped her. She crashed into a wall of solid muscle and expensive wool. A scent washed over her, sandalwood, rain, and the metallic tang of cold steel. It was a scent that didn't belong in a corporate office. It belonged to the shadows. "I have her," a voice vibrated through her shoulder, a low, melodic baritone that silenced the entire room. Naomi's head lulled back, her askew glasses falling away as she looked up through a haze of pain. Above her, the angular, lethal face of Joon-seo loomed. His dark hair was perfect, his expression a mask of controlled, terrifying calm. But it was his eyes, intense, focused, and burning with a sudden, dark fire, that held her. His massive hand, mapped with a dark tattoo that disappeared beneath his cuff, gripped her waist with a possessive strength that felt like an anchor. In that moment, the boardroom vanished. There was only the steady beat of the dragon's heart against her ear, and the realization that the man everyone feared had just stepped out of the shadows to catch her. Naomi's eyes drifted shut, her body finally limp in his arms, as the scent of the monster became her only sanctuary. The transition from the boardroom to the obsidian tower felt like a fever dream of velvet and steel. When Naomi's eyes finally fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the corporate world had been replaced by a soft, amber twilight. She was lying on a bed that felt like a cloud, draped in silk sheets that cost more than her annual salary, but the luxury did little to ease the instinctive alarm ringing in her chest. She tried to sit up, but a sharp, biting hiss escaped her lips as her ribs protested the movement. The pain was still there, but it felt distant, muffled by something stronger than the over-the-counter pills she had been popping like candy. "Don't," a voice commanded from the shadows. Naomi froze. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling glass wall was Joon-seo. The city lights of Manhattan glittered behind him, a sea of diamonds that seemed to bow to his silhouette. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar and sleeves rolled back to reveal the intricate, dark ink of the dragon winding around his forearm. He looked less like a CEO and more like the sovereign of a dark kingdom. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice sounding thin and raspy in the vast room. "You are in the only place in this city where Marcus Sterling cannot reach you," Joon-seo said, his angular features illuminated by a flicker of lightning from a distant storm. He stepped into the light, his movements graceful and predatory. "My private residence, the Obsidian Tower." Naomi looked around, her rectangular glasses, now cleaned and resting on the nightstand, catching the light. The room was a fortress of high-end technology and ancient aesthetics. Armed guards weren't visible, but the pressurized silence of the suite suggested a security system that could lock down the entire block with a single command. "I have a life, Mr. Han. I have a job. I have to go back," she argued, though her body felt like lead. Joon-seo reached the edge of the bed. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical weight, an anchor that demanded her total attention. "The woman who collapsed in that boardroom is dead, Naomi." The senior auditor who tried to hide her broken bones behind a blazer no longer exists. He leaned down, his intense eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying clarity. "Sterling thinks you're a liability he can erase. I think you're a genius he was too stupid to value. From this moment on, your only job is to heal. You aren't an employee anymore." He reached out, his thumb grazing the edge of the silk bandage now wrapped around her torso. The touch was surprisingly gentle, a jarring contrast to the lethal calm in his gaze. "You are the Han Syndicate's most protected secret now," he whispered, "and I don't lose what belongs to me." Naomi looked at the hand on the bed, the tattooed hand that had caught her when the world went dark, and realized the cage had changed. The corporate trap had been replaced by a gilded fortress, and the monster holding the key was the only thing keeping her alive. The clinical scent of the penthouse was suddenly overtaken by the sharp, metallic tang of Joon-seo's fury. He moved away from the window, his strides slow and deliberate, the silk of his shirt straining against shoulders that seemed to broaden with every second of silence. He stopped at the foot of the bed, his presence looming like a thundercloud over the high-end medical equipment. "The name, Naomi," he said. His voice was no longer a baritone murmur. It was a low, vibrating growl that made the glass walls of the obsidian tower seem to tremble. Naomi gripped the edge of the silk sheets, her knuckles white. Even now, with the ghost of Marcus Sterling's heavy breathing echoing in her ears, her first instinct was to shield herself through silence. She knew how the world worked. If she spoke, she became a witness. If she became a witness, she became a target. "It doesn't matter. I can handle it. I just need to get back to my files, get the evidence." "You can barely draw breath without gasping in pain," Joon-seo interrupted, his eyes flashing with a lethal, predatory light. He leaned over the bed, his hands flat on the mattress, caging her in. The dark ink on his wrists seemed to writhe in the dim light. "You are an auditor, Naomi. You deal in facts. The fact is someone broke your body. The fact is I am going to break theirs. Give me the name." "No," she whispered, her eyes burning with a mix of defiance and terror. "If you kill him, I'm just another victim in a mafia war. I won't be part of your violence." Joon-seo straightened up, a cold, mirthless smile touching his angular features. It was a terrifying expression, the look of a man who had already won a game his opponent didn't even know they were playing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black smartphone, tossing it onto the bed. "You think I waited for your permission?" he asked. Naomi looked down at the screen. It was a live feed from a dark, industrial warehouse. Bound to a chair in the center of a concrete floor was Marcus Sterling. His mouth was gagged, his expensive suit rumpled and stained, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic fear she had never seen in him before. Standing behind him were two men in black suits, their faces as stone-cold as the man standing before her. "I knew the moment I caught you in that boardroom," Joon-seo said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. "I saw the way he looked at you. I saw the way you flinched when he moved his hand. I don't need a confession to recognize a scavenger." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "The war didn't start when you woke up, Naomi. It started the second his blood hit the floor of that parking garage. You wanted justice. I am giving you retribution. Watch." As the men on the screen moved towards Sterling, Naomi realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that she wasn't just being protected. She was being claimed by a monster who would burn the world down just to keep her embers glowing. The corporate battle was over. The bloodbath had begun. The 50th floor of Nexus Holdings usually hummed with the quiet, predatory energy of high finance, but today the air felt vacuum-sealed, devoid of its usual life. Marcus Sterling stepped out of the private elevator, adjusting his silk tie with fingers that were still slightly unsteady. He had spent the night convincing himself that Naomi Pierce was a non-issue, a dead girl walking whose body would eventually be handled by the professionals he kept on retainer. But as he reached the heavy oak doors of his corner office, the professional mask he wore began to crack. The security detail that usually stood like statues at the entrance was gone. In their place sat a single, obsidian-black envelope on the floor. Marcus pushed the doors open, and the breath died in his throat. The office hadn't just been robbed, it had been surgically erased. His custom mahogany desk was bare. The walls, once adorned with degrees and accolades, were stripped to the drywall. Even the carpet had been rolled away, leaving cold, industrial concrete that looked like a basement floor. His laptop, his files, his entire digital footprint, gone. It was as if Marcus Sterling had never existed within these walls. "Looking for something, Marcus?" The voice didn't come from behind him, but from the intercom on his empty wall. It was low, distorted, and carried the chilling resonance of a predator playing with its food. Panic, sharp and cold, flared in Marcus's chest. He reached for his phone to call his cleaners, the team of ex-Special Forces mercenaries he used for the company's dirty work. The call connected on the first ring, but there was no voice on the other end. Only the rhythmic, wet sound of a heavy bag being struck, followed by a muffled, agonizing groan that Marcus recognized all too well. It was the lead of his security team. "They won't be coming," the voice through the intercom whispered. "They've been reassigned." Suddenly, the massive digital stock ticker that ran across the far wall of the office flickered. The green and red numbers vanished, replaced by a high-definition loop of the parking garage security footage from 3 nights ago. Marcus watched himself corner Naomi. He watched himself strike her. The footage was crystal clear, zoomed in until his own snarling face filled the entire wall. Below the video, a countdown timer appeared in blood-red digits. 00, 59, 59. Every screen in the hallway, every tablet in the building, began to broadcast the same loop. The psychological walls Marcus had built around his crimes were being hammered down by a force he couldn't see. He wasn't being arrested, he was being hunted. The Mafia didn't use HR reports or legal filings, they used the terror of the void. Marcus backed away from the screen, stumbling into the empty hallway, only to find the lights flickering out one by one, plunging the 50th floor into a terrifying, obsidian silence. The dragon wasn't just coming for his life, he was devouring his sanity first. The silence of the obsidian tower was heavy, pressing against the floor-to-ceiling glass like a physical weight. Inside the master suite, The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of the rain against the reinforced panes. Naomi sat on the edge of the sprawling bed, wrapped in a robe of charcoal silk that felt like water against her sensitized skin. The door clicked open, and Han Joon-seo entered. He had traded his sharp blazer for a simple black t-shirt that clung to the powerful lines of his frame. In his hands, he carried a silver tray with a bowl of warm water and fresh bandages. There was no bodyguard, no assistant, only the man whose name was whispered in fear throughout the city's underground. "I can do it myself," Naomi whispered, her fingers clutching the lapels of the robe. Joon-seo didn't answer. He knelt on the floor between her knees, his presence grounding and immense. "You have spent enough time doing everything yourself, Naomi. Let go." With a trembling hand, she let the silk slide from her shoulders. In the soft glow of the amber lamps, the bruises across her ribs were a violent map of purple and yellow. She flinched as he dipped a cloth into the water, but his touch was impossibly light. He moved with a clinical precision that was undercut by a simmering, protective heat. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice catching as he gingerly wiped away the remnants of the day's tension. "To the world, you're the dragon. You're the man who erases people. Why play nurse for an auditor?" Joon-seo paused, his dark eyes lifting to hers. Instead of answering, he reached for the hem of his shirt and pulled it over his head. Naomi's breath hitched. His torso was a landscape of old trauma. Thick white lines from blades crossed his chest, and a jagged, puckered starburst from a bullet wound sat just above his hip, marring the intricate dragon tattoo that scaled his ribs. "Because I know what it's like to carry a war under your clothes," he said, his voice a low, rough velvet. He took her hand, guiding her fingers to a long scar that ran down his shoulder. "This was from my father when I was 12. This," he pointed to the bullet wound, "was the night I realized that being a monster was the only way to protect the few things I cared about." The distance between them vanished. In the dim light, the predatory CEO and the broken auditor were gone, replaced by two souls who spoke the language of scars. Naomi realized that his violence wasn't just a tool. It was a shield he had forged from his own pain. "You aren't a monster to me," she breathed, her courage finally outweighing her fear. Joon-seo leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his tattooed hands framing her face with a tenderness that felt more dangerous than his rage. "Then don't look away, Naomi. Because for you, I will be whatever you need me to be." The 50th floor of Nexus Holdings felt like a tomb, the silence so heavy it seemed to vibrate against the glass. The board members were already seated, their faces pale, eyes darting toward the empty seat where Marcus Sterling should have been. When the double doors finally swung open, it wasn't a security team that entered. It was Han Joon-seo, and at his side, Naomi Pierce. She walked with a measured grace, her back straight despite the lingering ache in her ribs. She was no longer wearing the oversized blazers of a woman trying to disappear. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that matched the cold steel in her gaze. Joon-seo didn't take his usual place at the head of the table. Instead, he pulled out a chair for Naomi, seating her in a position of power before leaning back against the mahogany surface, his arms crossed over his chest. "I believe we have some unfinished business," Joon-seo said, his voice a low, terrifying hum that made several executives flinch. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply nodded toward Naomi. With a steady hand, she opened a sleek black laptop and tapped a single key. Every screen in the room came to life, not with stock tickers, but with the digital ghost of Marcus Sterling's greed. Thousands of documents, bank transfers to offshore accounts, falsified shipping manifests, and encrypted communications, scrolled by in a dizzying blur of red. "The embezzlement total is 42 million, Naomi stated, her voice projecting with a clarity that filled every corner of the room. "These files trace the path of every cent, beginning with Marcus Sterling and ending in the personal accounts of 3 other men currently sitting at this table." The air left the room. 3 board members turned the color of ash as their private ledgers were projected for the entire board to see. Joon-seo watched them, his expression one of bored lethality. He wasn't just exposing a crime, he was performing a public execution of their reputations. You thought you could use my company as a playground, Joon-seo whispered, stepping toward the center of the room. The light caught the tattoo on his wrist as he placed a hand on the table. You thought you could hurt the woman who found you out and simply walk away. Joon-seo, please, we can explain, one man stammered. There is no explanation for theft, Joon-seo interrupted, his gaze shifting to Naomi with a look of dark pride. And there is no mercy for those who lay hands on what belongs to the dragon. By the time you leave this building, your assets will be frozen, your names will be blacklisted from every exchange on the planet, and the authorities will be waiting in the lobby. He leaned down, his face inches from the lead conspirator. You should have feared the auditor more than the Mafia. She's the one who truly destroyed you. Naomi closed the laptop with a definitive click. The purge was complete. As Joon-seo led her out of the room, leaving behind a wake of ruined men, Naomi realized she wasn't just a witness anymore. She was the weapon he had chosen to wield. The aftermath of the boardroom purge left a vacuum that Marcus Sterling attempted to fill with the frantic, jagged energy of a dying man. He knew he couldn't beat Han Joon-seo in a fair fight, so he chose the only currency he had left: chaos. Naomi stood in the private elevator of the Obsidian Tower, the quiet hum of the machinery, a stark contrast to the thundering of her heart. The doors slid open to the subterranean parking level, where Joon-seo's driver was supposed to be waiting. Instead, the garage was a tomb of concrete shadows and flickering amber light. A sudden, screeching peal of tires echoed through the hollow space. A black SUV barreled toward her, its headlights blinding white suns. Naomi dove behind a structural pillar, the stone vibrating as the vehicle slammed into a parked sedan inches from her. Marcus Sterling stepped out of the driver's side, his eyes bloodshot and crazed, a heavy-caliber pistol shaking in his hand. You think you're safe because you found a bigger monster, Sterling screamed, his voice cracking against the low ceiling. He's going to discard you the moment you aren't useful. I'm the only one who knows what you really are. Naomi pressed her back against the cold concrete, her breath coming in shallow hitches. To her left, the emergency exit was 10 feet away, a clear path to the street, to the police, to a life where she could disappear and never look back. To her right, a black sedan drifted silently out of the darkness, the window rolling down to reveal the cold, obsidian eyes of Han Joon-seo. Joon-seo didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't scream. He simply stepped out of the car, standing in the open, his tattooed hand extended toward her. It was a silent invitation, a crossroads disguised as a gesture. Naomi, Joon-seo's voice was a low anchor in the storm of Sterling's hysteria. You can run. I've already put the credits in your account. You can leave this world and never see blood again, or you can walk to me and we finish this, together. Sterling leveled the gun at Joon-seo, his finger whitening on the trigger. Naomi looked at the exit, then at the man who had cleaned her wounds with the same hands that crushed his enemies. She realized that running was just another way of being invisible, another way of letting the world break her in silence. She didn't want a prince to hide her away. She wanted the dragon to help her burn the fear out of her soul. With a steady hand, Naomi stepped out from behind the pillar. She didn't look at Sterling's gun. She looked only at Joon-seo. She walked toward him, her footsteps echoing with a final, definitive rhythm. As she reached him, she placed her hand in his. His grip was a vice, a promise of absolute protection and absolute ruin for those who opposed them. Kill him, Naomi whispered, her voice a cold, sharp blade. Joon-seo's eyes flared with a dark, triumphant pride. He pulled her behind the safety of his frame as his men emerged from the shadows like ghosts. The choice was made. Naomi Pierce was no longer running. She was coming home to the fire. The silence in Han Joon-seo's private study was different from the clinical quiet of the corporate world. It was a heavy, expectant silence that hummed with untapped potential. Naomi sat at a sprawling desk carved from reclaimed ebony, her rectangular glasses pushed up as she pored over a digital web of shell companies and offshore accounts that even the most seasoned federal agents couldn't untangle. You're not just looking at the flow of money, Joon-seo observed, his voice a low rumble behind her. He stood by the window, a glass of dark amber liquid in his hand, his black shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dragon ink that seemed to pulse in the dim light. "You're looking for the leak." "I'm looking for the inefficiency," Naomi corrected, her eyes darting across the glowing screens. "The Hand Syndicate is powerful, but it's bleeding. Your legitimate fronts, the shipping firms, the real estate holdings, are being drained by middle managers who think they can skim off the top because they're afraid of your gun, but not your spreadsheets." Joon-seo stepped closer, placing a hand on the back of her chair. The heat from his body was a constant, grounding force. "Most people in my world think power is a bullet. They think I kept you here as a trophy, or perhaps a secret to be guarded." Naomi turned in her seat, meeting his intense, focused gaze. "And what do you think?" "I think a bullet can only kill one person at a time," he whispered, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "But a mind like yours, it can dismantle an entire empire or build one that never falls. I didn't catch you just to save you, Naomi. I caught you because you are the only person I've ever met who sees the world the way I do, as a series of moves that everyone else is too blind to notice." A shiver that had nothing to do with fear raced down Naomi's spine. For the first time, she realized that Joon-seo didn't want her to be a silent partner or a hidden mistress. He wanted her to be his architect. He was offering her the one thing the corporate world had tried to beat out of her: absolute agency. "If I do this," Naomi said, her voice growing stronger, "I restructure everything. I cut out the rot, I automate the logistics, and I turn your legitimate side into a force that doesn't need shadows to hide in. I won't be a secretary, Joon-seo. I won't be a shadow." "I don't want a shadow," Joon-seo replied, his tattooed hand coming up to frame her jaw with a fierce, possessive pride. "I want a queen who knows how to move the pieces while I guard the board." Naomi looked back at the screens, the data no longer looking like a burden, but like a weapon. She began to type, her fingers flying across the keys with a lethal precision. She was no longer just an auditor hiding bruises. She was the mind behind the dragon, and together, they were going to rewrite the rules of the city. The night air atop the Han estate was crisp, smelling of distant rain and the limitless possibility of the skyline. Naomi stood at the marble railing, her silhouette sharp against the shimmering tapestry of Manhattan. The white office blouse she had worn on the day of her collapse was a ghost of the past. Tonight, she wore a gown of midnight velvet, the fabric heavy and regal. Pinning the silk at her shoulder was a brooch of obsidian and silver, the soaring crest of the Hand Syndicate. She reached up, her fingers grazing her cheekbone. The swelling was gone, the skin smooth and clear. Beneath her dress, the fractures in her ribs had knitted back together, leaving behind a strength that felt forged in fire rather than mere bone. For the first time in her life, she wasn't breathing in shallow, fearful sips. She was drawing in the world, deep and steady. A heavy warmth settled against her back as Han Joon-seo stepped out of the shadows of the penthouse. He didn't say a word, his presence a silent vow as he wrapped his arms around her waist. His tattooed hands, capable of such precise and terrible violence, came to rest over hers on the cold marble. The dark ink of the dragon on his wrist peeked out from his cuff, a mirror to the crest she now wore. "The city looks different from here," Naomi whispered, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "It looks like yours," Joon-seo replied, his baritone vibrating through her. "The logistics are stabilized. The board is silent. The men who thought you were a liability are nothing but footnotes in a history we are rewriting." Naomi looked out over the glittering grid of the city. She thought back to the woman who had tried so hard to be invisible, the girl who thought self-reliance meant suffering in silence. She realized now that her greatest act of bravery hadn't been standing up to Marcus Sterling in that parking garage. It had been the moment she allowed herself to fall into the arms of the monster who was waiting to catch her. She wasn't his captive. And she wasn't just his auditor. She was the mind that directed the dragon's fire. Together, they had built a fortress out of their shared scars, a kingdom where vulnerability was the foundation of an unbreakable rule. "We aren't hiding anymore," she said, her voice echoing with a new, sovereign authority. Joon-seo turned her in his arms, his intense gaze locking onto hers. He didn't look at her with pity, but with a fierce, intoxicating equality. He leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a seal of their dark pact. We never will again, he promised. As the lights of Manhattan burned bright below them, the sovereign couple of the Han Syndicate stood together. The strategist and the boss, the mind and the sword, ruling a city that finally knew exactly who they were.